Christy was a beautiful young woman with her whole life ahead of her. Her body and mind were free from the trappings of the world. She avoided piercings and tattoos and barely wore any makeup throughout her youth. The stress of living with two career-driven parents inclined her to pursue a life of solitude, a life of escapism on her own, freedom of the soul. She had the voice of an angel and the aura of a saint. All the more reason as to why it was such a shame, such a tragedy to the world and everything in it, when that evil, grizzled, hulking grizzly bear dragged her frail body away by her skinny little thigh and tore her to pieces, only leaving behind the parts that it didn't like. Her blood could be heard screaming from the ground. What's up, guys? Iceman here. So this is a horrifying story regarding one of those van life girls and a horrid grizzly bear attack. But before I get into it, I'd like to thank you all for your support on this channel. And if you will, like this video, subscribe to the page, and paw that bell so you're notified next time I post a video. And blessings to my patrons. Links in the description below. So let's get into this chilling tale. Grizzly bears have a massive head with a prominent nose, rounded, inconspicuous ears, small eyes, short tail, and a large, powerful body. The facial profile is concave, and there is a noticeable hump above the shoulders. The claws on the front feet of adults are about 4 inches long and slightly curved. Grizzly bears range widely in color and size. The most prevalent coloration of grizzly bears in Montana is medium to dark brown underfur, brown legs, hump, and underparts, with light to medium grizzling on the head and back, and a light patch behind the front legs. Christy made some bad decisions growing up. She would get involved with men who were older than herself, often ones who her dad despised. But yet she stayed active after her high school years, playing tennis in a minor league and hiking the wooded trails of Wisconsin during the summer and fall. She pursued an education in photography, which ultimately led to her adventurous lifestyle. She ended up purchasing a Dodge Sprinter van after researching various vehicles most suitable for living. It was spacious, and she had a fold-out bed within it, a small fridge and microwave, and plenty of room for storage and toiletries. Against her parents' will, she took on the great adventure to southern Montana, alone and free, where she envisioned a budding career in solo photography. She would often park her van at the edge of national forest, occasionally staying at campgrounds, but often secluded ones. She would take notice to others who lived in their vans as well on her journey, but ended up staying primarily down a small dirt road that backed up to national land, not far from Yellowstone. There, she would photograph various animals in their beautiful natural habitats, birds of various kinds, large woodpeckers, caribou, elk, the occasional fox and bison. There, she dwelled in the most beautiful, breathtaking landscape she ever imagined. One eerie night, a large grizzly bear came up near her van. She could hear its heavy breathing as it foraged the ground for food. It would huff and snort as it dug near her van and crossed over to the fire pit to dig some more. Wow, what a beautiful creature, Christy thought to herself as she photographed the majestic grizzly. The following day, she was approached at a local grocery store while purchasing her basic needs. A 6-foot-tall, 30-some man who had an almost younger demeanor about him compared to his age. Ryan wore a flat-billed baseball cap, an oversized Affliction t-shirt, long shorts, and Converse shoes. He was clean-shaven, and he had tattoos strewn up and down his arms, making their way up his neck. He had a confident but thuggish voice about him, and a playful, yet somewhat demeaning way of mocking and teasing with Christy that balanced on the line of flirtatiousness, and managed to convince Christy to spend time with him that very day. Something about his persona and charisma mysteriously gave Christy a sort of sense of comfort comfort around him, a sort of trust, but perhaps misguided. That very night, he slept in her van with her at her campsite. Christy breathed heavily and bit her lip as Ryan ravenously thudded against her. He climaxed and almost instantly pushed her off of him and stepped outside the van, naked but still wearing his baseball cap. He left the door open behind him and lit up a cigarette, taking in the fine smoke deep within his lungs, and relaxed. He noticed the makeshift bathroom that Christy set up about 30 feet from where the van was parked, and he headed over that way. He pulled the draping tarp to the side and entered, and plopped down on a plastic potty and started pushing. It was at that moment he heard a crunching of dead leaves right outside the dainty cover. He quickly tried to think of his new girlfriend's name, but couldn't. "Is that you?" he grumbled, but to no answer. He playfully cursed at Christy, but still to nothing, to quietness. Suddenly, he heard the crunching of leaves again, but this time, it was right at the tarp door. He could see a massive, looming shadow tower overhead, and the young man shrieked in fear. He cursed again at whatever was between him and the thin plastic tarp, this time blatantly angry and concerned. Again there was silence, but something was still there, staring right into him. The silhouette of a massive, hulking, grizzled body, slowly moving as the creature breathed. The grizzly stood on its hind legs and looked down into the makeshift porta-potty that had no roof. It stood about 9.5 feet tall and looked down at the vulnerable man. Ryan looked up with his eyes wide and mouth open. His cigarette dropped from his lips as the bear stared right back at him, with drool oozing from its mouth. Suddenly, the giant creature crashed onto the porta-potty, bringing the tarp down with it atop the young man. Ryan began screaming in agony as the grizzly bear tore into him, wrapping its jaws around his face and clenching down tightly. Blood oozed from his neck as he gasped for air, and the bear began ripping its yellow, jagged claws into his bare chest. Ryan attempted to roll onto his belly, but couldn't, and the fangs of the bear tore into his neck, hitting some of the main arteries, causing blood to pool beneath him. From within the van, Christy heard the commotion and the moans of agony. She quickly sprung to her feet and draped her bathrobe over her naked body, and ran outside to see what has come upon her new boyfriend. In front of her, she saw the back of a giant creature ripping into her new lover. Ryan was already dead, his skull tilted in Christy's direction, half of the flesh torn from his scalp, and his eyeball popping out of its socket. The bear was eating him, and Christy screamed in horror. The high-pitched sound startled the creature, and its neck lunged in her direction as it peered its soulless eyes into her own. As though it could tell that she was not a threat, it turned back to the man's corpse and began digging into him all the more. Christy ran back into her van and grabbed a nonstick skillet and ran back out, shouting at the creature. She charged at the animal and swung as hard as she could, beating the pan over its massive skull. The bear quickly turned to her and tackled her to the ground over the man's bloodied carcass. It ripped into the young woman's bathrobe, gashing gaping wounds into her flesh, all up and down her body. Her high-pitched screams seemed to startle the creature as its ears went back, but it attacked her all the more. It wrapped its jaws around her thigh, puncturing her arteries, and began dragging her toward the thicket from which it came. Christy's body was ripped to shreds, and it wasn't until 3 days later that authorities investigated the scene. It was found that Ryan had a search warrant out for his arrest. He copulated with many women throughout the past several months before Christy met him, knowingly having an STD, but not confirming it to his consensual partners. His face was irrecognizable, and his cheek was eaten off. His right thigh was gnawed down like a used chicken bone, but he was easily identifiable from all his tattoos. Christy's body was mangled and half-eaten, buried in a cache about 30 yards from where her van stayed parked. The bear urinated and defecated on the cache, and when authorities arrived, it guarded it with all of its might. The bear charged the park rangers and was shot and killed on sight. This scene is a deadly reminder to always be cautious in bear country. Jeez, what do you guys think about that story? I know that the van life thing was pretty popular. I remember seeing videos on YouTube regarding it some years ago. There's all these young ladies and stuff who feel comfortable enough to go out there all on their own into secluded regions and so forth. It just always made me think that if I were one of them, or if I were close to them or whatever, I'd probably recommend that they carry a boomstick on their great adventures. But I've really never heard of one mention it. And it's crazy how they put themselves out there online so creepers can creep in. In this case, of course, the guy found her at the grocery store, and I don't think he knew who she was in terms of her social media presence. But nonetheless, it all went down the way it did, and it was quite a hideous thing. But what do you think could have been done to prevent this situation? Did Christy make bad decisions, or was she just kind of a victim of her circumstance? I'd appreciate what you guys have to say about all this in the comments below, and if you will, like this video, subscribe to the page, and I'm not a bot, so support this channel to support humanity, if you will, and become a patron if you want to support me further. I'll see you soon with more chilling tales from the Iceman.